Move to the
Somewhere
ships.
beneath the mist of post-Roman Britain, in the ash
Cast
and
off the
ruin
lines.
left behind by
Prepare
collapsing
the
empire,
sails.
a name begins to surface in fragments of chronicles, in scraps of Welsh poetry, in whispered oral memory passed between generations who had no writing left to preserve their own history. The name is Arthur, not yet a king in shining armor, not yet a knight of chivalry and courtly love, but a war leader, a shadow moving through the burned villages of a broken land, rallying the last defenders of Roman Britain against a rising tide of invasion. Who was he? A general who won 12 battles that no other record fully confirms? A composite memory of several men stitched into one legendary figure by desperate storytellers? Or something else entirely? A myth born from grief, from a need of a defeated people to believe that someone, somewhere had once held the line? Historians have searched monasteries, battlefields, and genealogies for centuries trying to answer this question, and the deeper they dig, the more the ground shifts beneath them. This is the story of how a possible warrior of the 5th century became the most powerful king in the history of imagination, and how the truth of Arthur may be stranger, sadder, and far more human than the legend that swallowed him whole. We will not give you certainty. Certainty is not something the fall of Rome left behind in Britain. What we will give you is everything that survives, the chronicles, the poems, the archaeology, the centuries of embellishment, laid out so you can see, layer by layer, how a man may have become a myth, and how that myth still shapes the world today. When the Roman legions withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, they left behind a province stripped of its central authority, its currency, its administrative backbone, and, most dangerously, its unified defense. For nearly 400 years, Britain had lived inside the architecture of empire. Paved roads connecting fortified towns, a professional army stationed along the frontiers, a monetary economy that oiled trade from Mediterranean to the wall. Then, almost overnight by historical standards, that scaffolding was gone. Rome itself was buckling under pressure from Gothic invasions, and in 410 CE, the Emperor Honorius reportedly told the Britons to look to their own defenses. What followed was not an instant collapse, but a slow, uneven unraveling, a period modern historians call sub-Roman Britain, a twilight zone between the ordered world of antiquity and the fractured kingdoms of the early medieval period. Roman British elites, still speaking Latin and organizing themselves along Roman administrative lines, try to hold together a semblance of governance. But without the legions, without the tax structure that paid for them, the old world was dying, and something new and far more dangerous was rising from across the North Sea. Anglo-Saxon peoples, Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and other Germanic groups for what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands, began arriving in greater numbers, first as mercenaries hired by British rulers to help defend against Pictish and Irish raids, and later as settlers and conquerors in their own right. The tradition of the tyrant Vortigern inviting Saxon warlords Hengist and Horsa to Britain as federati, only to see them turn against their hosts, appears in multiple early sources, though the details vary and the reliability of any single account is deeply contested. What is not contested is the broad pattern. British resistance to Germanic expansion became the central military and political struggle of 5th and 6th century Britain, and out of that struggle, in fragments too scattered to fully reconstruct, the name Arthur begins to emerge. The earliest textual mention that scholars generally treat as significant comes from a Welsh poem called Y Gododin, attributed to the poet Aneurin, believed to describe events around 600 CE, though the surviving manuscript is centuries later. Within it, praising a warrior's bravery, the poet notes that even this man was no Arthur, implying that by this point, Arthur was already a benchmark of heroism, a reference point so well known it needed no introduction. This tells historians something crucial. Whoever or whatever Arthur was, his reputation as a peerless warrior predates the elaborate medieval romances by hundreds of years. He was, at minimum, already a legend in the oral tradition of early Wales long before French poets ever gave him a round table. The next major source is the Historia Brittonum, a Latin historical compilation traditionally attributed to a Welsh monk named Nennius, dated to around 828 CE. This text does something no earlier surviving source does explicitly. It lists 12 battles fought by Arthur against the Saxons, culminating in the Battle of Mount Badon, where it claims Arthur single-handedly killed 960 men in one charge, a number so exaggerated that even sympathetic historians treat it as pure hagiographic embellishment rather than history. Yet buried within that exaggeration is something intriguing. The Battle of Mount Badon itself is independently corroborated, at least in outline, by an earlier and far more sober source. The 6th century British monk Gildas, writing in his polemical work De Excidio et Conquesta Britanniae, likely composed within living memory of the battle itself. Gildas describes a decisive British victory against the Saxons at a site he calls Mons Badonicus, which halted Saxon expansion for a generation. Crucially, Gildas does not name Arthur at all. He credits the victory to a Roman-British leader named Ambrosius Aurelianus, describing him as a man of Roman lineage whose parents had worn the purple and who rallied the survivors of Saxon assaults into a fighting force capable of turning the tide of war. This absence of Arthur's name in Gildas, the closest thing to a contemporary witness we possess, is one of the strongest pieces of evidence historians point to when arguing that Arthur is either a much later invention or a title, an epithet, or a secondary commander whose name simply wasn't significant enough to Gildas to record. Some scholars argue that Ambrosius Aurelianus and Arthur may be connected in some way, perhaps predecessor and successor, mentor and protege, or two names remembered separately for the same set of victories. Others point instead to Riothamus, a 5th century British king recorded in continental sources as leading an army into Gaul to support the collapsing Western Roman Empire against the Visigoths, a campaign that ended in defeat and Riothamus vanishing from the historical record near a town called Avalon, a name whose resemblance to the legendary Isle of Avalon has fascinated historians for generations. Still others trace a possible route not to a native Briton at all, but to a Roman officer named Lucius Artorius Castus, who commanded troops in 2nd century Britain, centuries before the events usually associated with Arthur, whose name Artorius bears a striking philological resemblance to Arthur, and whose military command included Sarmatian cavalry auxiliaries whose own legends of heroic horsemen and magic swords have led some historians to speculate about cultural transmission into later British folklore. None of these theories can be proven. All of them remain live debates within Arthurian scholarship, a field defined less by consensus and more by competing plausible reconstructions built from fragmentary, unreliable, and often contradictory sources. What can be said with more confidence is that between the collapse of Roman authority and the eventual Anglo-Saxon dominance of most of lowland Britain, there existed a period of British resistance that was real, sustained, and at times successful, and that within the memory of the people who lived through it and their descendants, one name rose above the rest as the symbol of that resistance. Whether Arthur commanded the actual battles listed in the Historia Brittonum, whether he was a real war leader whose deeds were later inflated, whether he was a folk memory retroactively given a name, or whether he was, as some skeptics argue, a purely literary invention with no historical anchor whatsoever, remains one of the most enduring open questions in medieval historiography. The honest answer the one this documentary insists on giving you, is that we do not know, and anyone who claims certainty in either direction, that Arthur definitely existed as described, or that he definitely did not exist at all, is overstating the evidence. What we do know is how the legend grew, and that growth is in its own right one of the most remarkable phenomena in the history of storytelling. The Annals Cambrii, a set of Welsh chronicle entries compiled around the 10th century but claiming to draw on earlier material, adds two more entries to the Arthurian record. The Battle of Badon, dated to around 516, where Arthur is said to have carried the cross of Jesus Christ on his shoulders for 3 days and nights, and the Battle of Camelot, dated to around 537, where Arthur and a figure named Medrawd, later transformed into the traitorous Mordred, are both said to have fallen. These entries are brief, almost telegraphic, but they establish two pillars of the later legend: Arthur's Christian piety and his tragic death at the hands of a kinsman, themes that would be endlessly elaborated in the centuries to come. The transformation of Arthur from shadowy war leader into a full-blown monarch with a court, a wife, a wizard, and a code of chivalry begins in earnest with Geoffrey of Monmouth, a Welsh cleric writing in the 1130s whose Historia Regum Britanniae, or History of the Kings of Britain, is arguably the single most influential work of pseudo-history ever written in the English language's cultural sphere. Geoffrey claimed to be translating an ancient British book given to him by a friend, a claim modern historians almost universally treat as a literary device rather than a genuine source. Since no such book has ever surfaced, and much of Geoffrey's material appears to be his own invention, blended with earlier Welsh tradition, classical historiography, and biblical narrative structure. In Geoffrey's hands, Arthur becomes the son of Uther Pendragon, conceived through the magical intervention of the wizard Merlin, who disguises Uther as the Duke of Cornwall so he can lie with the Duke's wife, Igraine, a story steeped in moral ambiguity that later retellings would soften or omit. Geoffrey gives Arthur a sword, which he calls Caliban, a Latinized precursor to the later Excalibur, and describes Arthur not merely as a defender of Britain, but as a conqueror who subdues Ireland, Iceland, and parts of continental Europe, eventually challenging the Roman Empire itself before being forced to return home to deal with the treachery of his nephew Mordred, who has seized his throne and his queen in his absence. It is in this final betrayal, at the Battle of Camelot, that Arthur is mortally wounded and carried away to the Isle of Avalon to be healed of his wounds, an ending deliberately ambiguous enough to suggest to the medieval audience craving hope that Arthur might one day return. Geoffrey's history, despite being almost entirely unreliable as a factual record, was a sensation. It spread rapidly across Britain and continental Europe, translated and adapted into French. It was in France that the legend underwent its next great transformation. Was, an Anglo-Norman poet writing in the 1150s, translated Geoffrey's history into French verse and added a detail that would become inseparable from the legend forever after: the Round Table, a symbol of equality among Arthur's warriors, a table with no head and no foot, so that no knight could claim precedence over another. This single invention reshaped the entire moral architecture of the Arthurian world, transforming Arthur's court from a conqueror's retinue into an idealized fellowship of knighthood bound by mutual honor. It was Chrétien de Troyes, a French poet writing for the courts of Champagne and Flanders in the latter half of the 12th century, who gave the Arthurian legend its most enduring literary form. The romance, a genre built around individual knights undertaking quests that tested their courage, their loyalty, and above all their capacity for courtly love. Chrétien introduced Lancelot du Lac, the greatest knight of the Round Table, whose forbidden love for Arthur's queen, Guinevere, would eventually become the fault line that cracked the entire fellowship apart. Chrétien also introduced, in his unfinished Romance Perceval, the mysterious vessel known as the Grail, a term whose meaning and religious significance he never fully explained before his work broke off, leaving generations of later writers to fill in the gap with increasingly elaborate Christian symbolism, until the Grail became identified with the cup of the Last Supper, and the quest for it became a spiritual allegory as much as an adventure narrative. Robert de Boron, writing shortly after Chrétien, deepened this Christian framing, connecting the Grail explicitly to the blood of Christ collected by Joseph of Arimathea, and introducing the story of the sword and the stone, the test by which the true king of Britain would be revealed, a device that solved a structural problem in the legend by explaining how a boy of uncertain parentage, raised in obscurity by Sir Ector after being spirited away by Merlin, could rightfully claim the throne of Britain against the challenge of rival lords. This is the version of Arthur's origin most familiar to modern audiences. The boy who pulls the sword from the stone, not through strength but through destiny and purity of heart, becoming king almost by accident, thrust into a role he did not seek but ultimately embraces with growing nobility. By the time these threads, the Welsh warrior tradition, Geoffrey's pseudo-historical monarch, the French romance of courtly love, and the Christian mysticism of the Grail, reached their fullest expression in English, they were gathered by Sir Thomas Malory, a knight writing, remarkably, from prison in the 1460s, likely while incarcerated for crimes ranging from theft to attempted murder. A biographical irony that has never stopped fascinating scholars given the moral idealism of the text he produced. Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur, printed by William Caxton in 1485 as one of the earliest and most significant works of English printing, synthesized centuries of French and British material into a single sprawling narrative that would become the definitive English-language version of the legend for the next 500 years. It is Malory who gives us the most complete and emotionally resonant version of the story's tragic architecture. The founding of the Fellowship under Arthur's wise but ultimately insufficient leadership, the slow corrosion of that fellowship through the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere, the near-total destruction of the Round Table during the quest for the Holy Grail, in which only 3 knights, Galahad, Percival, and Bors, are pure enough to achieve the vision fully in the final catastrophe at the Battle of Camelot, where Arthur's own illegitimate son, Mordred, born of an unwitting union with his half-sister Morgause in Geoffrey's earlier telling, seizes the throne and forces a final confrontation that destroys them both. The emotional power of this ending lies precisely in its refusal of simple villainy. Mordred is not a cartoonish traitor, but a figure born of Arthur's own moral failure, a symbol of the way that even the most idealistic order can carry the seeds of its own destruction within it. Lancelot and Guinevere's love is not framed as pure wickedness, but as a genuine, devastating human failing that undermines a system built on absolute loyalty. The Round Table falls not because of external conquest, but because of internal betrayal, jealousy, and the impossible standard of perfection it demanded from flawed people. This is why the Arthurian legend has resonated across so many centuries and so many cultures. Beneath the fantastical elements of magic swords and wizards and grails lies a deeply human story about the fragility of ideals, the corrosive power of secrecy and desire, and the tragic gap between the world we hope to build and the world our own weaknesses inevitably produce. The archaeology of this period offers tantalizing but inconclusive support for the broader historical context, if not for Arthur himself specifically. Excavations at Tintagel, the Cornish site Geoffrey of Monmouth named as Arthur's place of conception, have revealed genuine evidence of a high-status 5th and 6th century settlement, with imported Mediterranean pottery suggesting trade links far beyond what historians once assumed possible for post-Roman Britain, indicating that whatever site Geoffrey was drawing on, it was indeed a place of real power and prestige in the relevant period, even if no evidence connects it directly to any historical Arthur. Similarly, the hill fort of South Cadbury in Somerset, long associated by folklore with Camelot, shows evidence of significant refortification in the late 5th or early 6th century, a period when such large-scale defensive works would have required exactly the kind of centralized authority a war leader resisting Saxon expansion might have commanded. These findings do not prove Arthur existed. They prove that the world in which Arthur's story is set was real, dynamic, and capable of producing exactly the kind of leadership the legend describes, even if the specific man remains beyond the reach of the archaeological record. What ultimately matters, perhaps, is not whether a single man named Arthur once rode across 5th century Britain, but why his story could not stop growing. Every generation that inherited the legend added something the previous generation needed. The Welsh needed a hero who could hold back Saxon conquest, even in memory, if not an ultimate historical outcome. The Anglo-Norman elite who eventually conquered Britain in 1066 needed a native British monarch whose legendary greatness they could claim as their own inheritance, legitimizing their rule over a conquered land. The French courts needed a framework for exploring the new ideals of courtly love and knightly conduct. The Christian Church needed a vessel for its own most sacred symbolism. And English readers, emerging from the chaos of civil war in Malory's own lifetime, needed a story about the catastrophic cost of internal division within a nation. Arthur was never just one thing. He was a mirror each era held up to its own anxieties and aspirations. And the fact that the mirror kept reflecting something true is perhaps the deepest reason the legend refused to fade into the historical footnote that so many other 5th century warlords have become. In the centuries since Malory, the legend has continued its restless evolution, from Tennyson's Victorian reimagining in Idylls of the King, which used Arthur's fall as an allegory for the moral decay Tennyson feared in his own society, to Mark Twain's satirical A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, to 20th century cinema, to modern fantasy literature that borrows Arthurian structures wholesale. Each retelling reshapes the emphasis, the moral center, the very identity of the characters. Yet certain elements persist with astonishing consistency across nearly 1,000 years of retelling. The sword that proves kingship, the wizard who guides but cannot save, the fellowship that promises equality but cannot survive human weakness, the queen whose love destroys what she also adorns, and the king who dies without truly dying, carried to a mystical isle with the promise, never quite fulfilled, never quite abandoned, that he will return when Britain needs him most. That promise, the once and future king, is perhaps the single most telling detail in the entire legend, because it reveals what people actually wanted from Arthur. Not a historical record, not even a satisfying ending. What they wanted was the possibility that the ideal, however badly it failed the first time, might someday come again.